All right, everybody. I'm going to turn things over to Bob. Ask you to be as quiet as possible. Try to minimize the side conversations because it's very hard to hear in this room. And Bob's going to talk about Morris Kushner, somebody you knew quite well, and one of the most important contributors to rod making in the Midwest. So I'll turn it over to Bob.
Well, let's see. Morris was a very unique guy. I would say he was probably one of the smartest engineering minds that I ever met. And he was mostly self-educated. I don't think he ever had any real big formal engineering college or anything. But his big challenge was, he used to tell me, you want something made, bring it to me and I'll figure how to make it. And eventually ended up making the machinery to make it, how to do it. And he said, I always insisted I've got to go and train your personnel how to use it all. He was just took over everything, and he made so many things. He was really a legend around Detroit for solving problems. When somebody got a big contract, something wouldn't work. I remember one, there was a place, I think it was called Birmingham Benders, and they got a job to make the chrome around the Lincoln, the front window. The big show was coming up, and they could not make that compound curve going this way and that way all at the same time. So I said, turn it over to Morris. He worked in his shop by himself, like a week, night and day, and he made 2 sets of them, which got him through that show. And everybody liked to tell that story. But he did that with a lot of things. Oh, God, so many things I had neat experiences with him. When I first met him, I was working at the Paul H. Young Company. And at that point, we were a boat dealer, too, in Evinrude Outboards. Well, one of my jobs was I took care of the service. I went to Evinrude's factory school and all that kind of stuff. That was all along with the rod making. Well, Morris wanted a motor or something, and that's how he first came around there, to buy a motor. Well, that met me. Then pretty soon he got coming more and more, and he'd just come back into the shop where I'd be working. And I remember one time I was also a gun nut, and I had an old Springfield Army rifle I was converting, and I was working on it, polishing some of the parts of it, and he was really intrigued with that. And he said, you know, I got some stuff at the shop that I could show you how to really do that faster. So that got me to come to his shop, which was about 5 miles away. It was on Telegraph near 10 Mile Road. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And that was Kushner Engineering, is what it was. And it wasn't a big place. It was kind of small buildings, and when he got in need of more work, he just added on. And it was kind of a cobbled up mess. So anyway, I got there, and boy, I was really in love with all the stuff he was doing. And one thing I remember, there was a wall, about as big as that whole wall over there, and it was just full of little things about the size of your hand that he had done for somebody. One of them I remember was a car lock mechanism. When you close your car door, there's 2 things happen on that lock. Well, he patented certain little parts of that. And he remember saying, the big 3's paying me all the time for a little piece of that. Pretty smart guy. But he had a good business head, too. And I remember there was something there that did with a sewing machine, which a sewing machine has always intrigued me, how the heck it can make a zigzags and do all. He invented some of that stuff for people, and boom, that was like a prototype of the unit he made. So this kept on, and God, he'd come around the shop more and more when he seen the way the building was. It was a big back room where I was most of the time, and the big door would be open. So he'd just park and stroll in and come in there, and I don't think Mrs. Young liked it very well, but what's she going to do? And so we became quite good friends about that. Then at that point he was going to retire and sell all this operation to his son. So he was starting to play with the rods, the bamboo. And he had lots of ideas. It was just unbelievable because he put everything into how to make this thing better. It didn't make any difference what it was. We can make it and make it better, or different ways. So I remember we started talking about a mill. He wasn't going to hand plane. He was going to make something, what do you want to call it, more efficient or whatever, but it wasn't going to necessarily make a better rod or anything, but it was going to be able to make it easier, maybe would be the way to say. So I remember on that table, how are we going to make the table run? And we talked about hydraulic cylinders and a cable system and all that. Well, in the Evinrude outboard motor, when you move that handle and shift from forward to reverse, there's a little unit in the bottom with a propeller shaft. Then there's 2 gears on it, and the pinion gear turning those gears. Well, the one gear on one side is going to go one way, and the other one's going to go the other way. Well, there was a little shift dog in there that slides from one gear to the other when you move that lever. Well, them had little nubbins on it, and they wear out. So I had a pile of them systems scrapped like. So we got to talk about that. So I gave him a shaft and some of them gears and that stuff. Next thing I know, he machines a unit. He's got those in there. Because remember, this table, RPMs of that pinion is going to be somewhere maybe around 400 RPMs, not 4,000 like an outboard. So that worn out part didn't make any difference. It worked fine for making that table run. Before I know it, he had a mill going and everything else. And he was making rods, like that rod that you see over there that had been cut on that mill. So this just kept on, and I don't know. One time we took a fishing trip to Lake Nipigon, where the big brook trout are. And we stayed a week in a tent with an Indian guide. And of course, we fished all day long, right up into the dark, whatever you want. But I said we also spent a heck of a lot of time designing rod-making equipment and things, because at that point, he was out of the prototype engineering of everything else, and it was just rods. And we designed in our minds, didn't have any paper to draw things there. We should have took a big pads with us. And so that was a great week spent with him doing that. And then we caught some nice big brook trout, like 24 inches. And it was, which by the way, I heard that people say it's actually better there right now than it was back. That was like, I got one mounted, I think it was 1964. So, but if you wanted to go up there now, they say it's even better for some reason. So anyway, he made rods. I don't think he ever made any more than 2 the same. And a lot of his rods would be something I had, like some of the Paul Youngs, and he'd just measure it and make one like that. But he'd make a head, and he'd make panes, he'd make anything. So that's why I say there was hardly any 2 the same. Because his whole thing was experimental. Trial and error was the big thing. Let's make one. And a lot of times he'd call me up and, hey, boy, you got to try this. So I'd drive out to his place and we'd lawn cast a little bit. But his brain was constantly thinking of different ways to do it. I don't know what else but he made everything. He didn't, well, as you look on that reel seat, just like the little flat on there, some people wonder, how do you cut that flat? Well, in the regular shop business, it was common to have a cutter ground for whatever you were doing. There were people in Detroit, that was all they did was grind cutters. So if you wanted to change that radius a little on that thing, well, you just have somebody make him a different radius in that grinder. Or I'm sure he did grind some himself because his shop was full of mostly old stuff. There surely was no CNC at that time. But he'd take old lathes and rebuild them himself, an old machine. He was very frugal, and money. He didn't waste any money, I would say. I remember that Kush spoon you see there. He made those from way back. I don't know how early, but I remember seeing a room where he had about as big as this room, and it had a dozen old punch presses, not big ones, some of them only about yay big. And most of them were ones that I could see where he had patched them up. He probably bought them at the scrap yard. And he made the dies and he made all that. And one thing he did with that spoon, he had a winter home in Scottsdale, Arizona. And him and the wife would drive there. And he always had a new big car, like a big Cadillac or a big Chrysler Imperial. And the trunk would be full of cards with those spoons on it. So from here to Arizona, every little town he hit, he'd go to a bait shop or something, take his card in there, and sell them on a card of them. And he had them all gone by the time he got to Arizona. But by the time he got back to Detroit, here was a pile of orders for more of them. That was kind of his way of thinking. Everything he did, he didn't waste any time. And I'm sure he worked around the clock. I can remember his wife a couple times. She was kind of a little lady. And she'd say, "You got to tell him to slow down." He'd get on to something, and it was like 24 hours. He didn't stop. It was all the time working on it, whatever, until he got it to a satisfied position. But he was really quite a guy. I really enjoyed being with him just because we could really talk shop, and he was no nonsense guy. I never heard any jokes or anything like that. It was always about what we could do to make this a little better or a different method. And I don't know what he would have done with the CNC world now. It would have been, where's Mr. Bertram here? He makes a mill.
Right here.
There he is. He makes a CNC now. Well, remember back when Morris was doing that, I don't think we ever even heard the word, you know. But I know it was available at that time because it was all invented in Traverse City, you know that. The CNC method. John Parsons, which is starting to get some recognition now. You can find bring up the name John Parsons. John Parsons and Frank Stuhlin, they invented all that right on 12th Street. There's a big old plaque there for them now about that. But Morris made things automated. I remember in that mill thing, he took the gear system out of the outboard, and it would go so far, and he had a little cam set up where, boom, instead of you moving that hand, it moved it and kicked it out of gear. And then he was playing with the idea, they kicked it out of gear, but we made a rough cutter where it'd kick it out of gear, and another thing was going to lower that head to maybe another 5 thousandths, and then put it into shift automatically. But that never did happen. You know, I kind of curtailed. I said, there's going to be too much chance of something jamming up, you know, because the bamboo's got to set on that template. And if it just jumps off a little, you really got to, because see, I built my own mill, but now I'm getting ahead of myself, I guess. When Morris died, he died out in Arizona. But before he went there, he had his mill all apart. The spindle was gone somewhere. The cutters were gone somewhere, which we figured the spindle was probably somewhere in Detroit getting new bearings in it. And maybe the cutter, because we weren't cutters with inserts, were soldered in there. And then it took a pretty good grinder to grind that cutters to sharpen them, because they're in two halves. And when they come together, that apex of the angle has got to be dead nuts, or else it's like running your cane through a wood chipper, you know. So that had to be ground very precise. And there were people in Detroit that was their thing. They could grind something like that to 2/10 or better if you wanted to pay for it. So anyway, the cutters are gone, the spindle's gone, and he died. And his sons called me and says, Bob, he says, we know Morris would like you to have first crack at this whole shop if you want it. They weren't giving it to me. I had to buy it, but I had the first crack at it. So I go out there, and geez, here's the bench with nuts and bolts and just all piles of stuff. So of course I took it all. I said, I'll make it work. So I got it all home, and I went back. Detroit is like a shopping mall for me of used machinery and all kind of junk like that, they'd call it. So I did find a nice spindle, and it was in a used place. I remember it was on Warren Avenue, and I think it was the old DeSoto plant, and there was acres of used machinery in there. So I walk around and I find this spindle up in a thing, some special machine. Made a deal with a guy, and the guy said, well, you're gonna have to take it out of there. So he gave me a bunch of wrenches and stuff, and I spent half the day and I got the spindle out. He charged me very little for it then. So now while I was in Detroit, I said, how do I know how good it is? So I went to this, I think it's called Lumley Spindle Service in Detroit, and they put it on a bench and cranked it up and spun it up and said it's perfect, you know. So it got me the spindle. Now I took that home, and then I had his mill table and all that stuff. We put it all back together, and I got it running. And about that time, his grandson was going to university here to become a movie maker. So he wanted to make a movie of his grandfather. So he got hold of me and said, okay, I would like to have that mill in there running what Grandpa did. Well, he did. Now that movie's available. It's been on YouTube and a few things of his mill running. Well, at that time, I had already been building this mill on my own, which I had coming quite along, which I started with a base of a great big surface grinder. He saw it. Remember my big mill? So I said, well, I don't need this, and I could use the money to put in the big mill. So I sold Kushner's mill to Mike Spittler up in Minneapolis, and he's used it to make nice rods too. So that's where Kushner's mill ended up. So then it just kept going, but when I bought his stuff, that was a whole bunch of stuff. I bought a lathe, a drill press, just tons of little hand tools and all that kind of stuff all went with it. Because his sons, they were taking the Kushner engineering in a different big way. I mean, I assume they all got into CNC and stuff and everything else. And none of them were fishermen or had any interest in that. So that's why they just said, and they made me a hell of a deal. I forgot what the price was, but don't worry, pay us when you can, you know. And that was it. I guess they were kind of glad to see Grandpa's stuff keep going, you know. So anyway, that was what I'd done with Morris Kushner. Like I say, he was one of the smartest brains of making anything, but that was his thing. Everything had to be. I can remember saying to him, there isn't nothing to invent anymore, everything's done. He'd say, no. Everything that was ever brought out just opened the door for something new or better. And that was his attitude. There was anything he could find, he could make it better. Any questions?
Bob, you said that Morris